What's up, Pastor with No Answers fam? It's good to be back in your earbuds today with two of our most commonly appearing guests on this show, probably none other than Jack Hoey and Dan Koch. Jack the lesser, not his father, but the son, and trying a little something new here. I got 5 questions that I'm going to throw at both of them separately. They will not be recording together, and we are going to get their take on all 5. I'm going to go ahead and tell you the questions that I'm going to be telling these or asking these guys. First of all, what's the chances in your head that God isn't omnipotent, and why? Was the type of slavery in the Old Testament God-ordained? Are Christians persecuted in America? Does God choose the president of the United States, or do the people of the U.S. choose him, especially according to Romans 13? Is God being referred to as a father as a result of the cultural lenses of the day in which it was written, the Bible? Or is he just better served and worshipped in the context of a man? Going to throw these questions at these guys. There are time limitations, and we'll have some fun with it. Hope you enjoy it, and you can always go over there at pastorwithnoanswers.com. Follow this podcast on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter at Joey Svensson, and we also have a Patreon page, a little interactive group of folks that honestly, they love me, they love the podcast, and they feel good about supporting something that they believe in. So if that's up your alley, all of that can be found through Pastor with No Answers. Peace, love, and God bless you all. Oh, man. All right. Well, we are going to try something new today. I'm pretty excited about it. Jack is a very smart guy, and he's actually someone that I, in real life, will call when I have philosophical, theological questions. Always curious what he thinks, and so figured, hey, let's air some of this stuff. But to make it fun, there's going to be only 5 questions. There's going to be a 2-minute maximum amount of time that he can use for each of these questions. And I'll tell you what, Jack, at any time you can respond to the question by saying, I want 3 minutes on this one, but you can only do that once.
Oh, geez.
All right, just once. So if you use that on your first question, that's it. You don't, so you may want to save it, put it in your back pocket, and if you don't use it at all, that's fine as well. But now I'm curious. This, you know the vibe of this show, super informal, lots of laughs.
Yep.
You're not nervous at all, right? I mean, this isn't anything to be nervous about. Now, if it was your first time on here, but I mean, we're friends, so this is cool, right? Or are you a little nervous?
I wouldn't be nervous, but you're being very nonchalant about this, and I don't like that. So I wasn't nervous, but maybe I should be, is what I'm thinking now.
How would you want me to approach it? Okay, guys, we're going to do something super serious here. Jack is, like that tone. Is it the tone that's throwing
I don't know. It's just, I feel like this is a weird tone from you.
Okay.
Right? And I don't like it. I don't like it, Joey.
All right. Well, apologize for my tone. Not really. And here is the first question. Got to get my clock ready. And the first question is, dadgummit, this, I have a cracked screen, so everything's a little challenging on my iPhone. All right, chances in your head. So this is Jack's opinion / based on your knowledge. What are the chances that God is not omnipotent, and why? Go.
Not omnipotent. So omnipotent meaning he can do everything?
Yeah, all powerful.
0.
0 chances.
0 chances that he is not omnipotent. I guess, what I would say is, so like the typical omnipotence, riddle or trick question or whatever is, could God make a rock so big that he could not lift it?
Right.
And the best answer I ever heard to that question was actually from a professor that I had years ago in school, and his answer to that question was, yes, God could make a rock so big that he could not lift it, and then he'd lift it. In other words, can God do the impossible? Yes, and then he'll do the impossible again. And I always felt like that was the best answer to that question, right? Because it's really what that question gets at is anything impossible for God? And you can get into the things like, well, God can't lie, or God can't do evil. But that's not really an omnipotence question, right? Like,
Right.
being omnipotent doesn't mean being able to do things that, are contrary to your character. Just like, saying like, well, we're not really free in this country because I can't murder someone. That would be sort of a ridiculous basis.
Yeah.
So for me, there is a 0% chance that God is not omnipotent. So flip it around, there is a 100% chance that God is omnipotent. I think it is sort of inextricable from his nature. I think it would be contrary to his nature to be otherwise.
Gotcha. All right, good job within your time limit as well. So that with the time off the table, so you don't lend really any credibility towards open theism. Do you think that it is ridiculous?
So and this is one of the reasons I made a distinction between omnipotence and like specifically omnipotence being able to do anything, because for me, open theism is more about like the omniscience and God's knowing things.
Yeah. Sure.
So open theism to me is a very different question. It's something that I guess I brought it up, I don't know, probably a year ago at this point on the show, and I got some flack for it on Twitter.
Oh yeah.
And it's funny, like I didn't even remember bringing up open theism, but I did. I went back and listened. And sort of the feedback was I don't, that I wasn't taking it seriously, or that I hadn't really considered some of its claims, and it's fair in the sense that I hadn't really thought about it in like 10 years. And so, one of the things that I want to do on more of kind of a deep dive, question response in a later episode is kind of deal with open theism a little bit. But just like quick response, when I read about it 10, 15 years ago, I thought it was absurd. And read about it. I mean, like I really did study it for several months.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine it's going to be any more convincing this time. But I'm going to give it a fair shake.
Yeah, and I don't know what the technical definition of open theism is like, and maybe it technically it pertains just to his knowledge. But I have heard open theists explain God in a way of he's doing the best he can, and so when bad stuff happens, God would have loved to prevent it, but he can't figure everything out. He can't do it all.
Well,
so it's almost like we're rooting for God. Come on, man, you can do this.
Yeah, well, so maybe, and this is not going to be a quote unquote definition of open theism, but sort of my understanding of open theism, and again, I'm going to do the best I can based on kind of what I read years ago, is from my understanding, open theism is basically founded on the idea that there are some things that are so important to God that he voluntarily limits his knowledge.
Yeah.
Essentially to kind of protect free will.
Yeah.
That's like a very paraphrased, very basic deal about open theism. And so it's not like he's incapable of doing certain things. It's just that within the limitations he has set for himself, that's sort of the result, right? Is that he doesn't know certain things. That's my understanding. That might be a fundamentally flawed understanding based on what's developed with the theology over the last 10, 15 years. I don't know.
Yeah, gotcha. All right. Second question, was the type of slavery in the Old Testament God-ordained?
Oh, man. You were the worst.
Careful now, careful. You don't want to get fired. You don't want your Twitter account to be shut down.
Yeah. No. But I'm going to get a little hair splitting here. No, it is not God ordained in the same way as divorce is not God ordained, even though you have laws to govern it in the Old Testament, right? Like, so when you look at the New Testament and the Pharisee, Jesus says, divorce for any reason, and maybe he said except for adultery, divorce for any reason is wrong. And the Pharisees say, then why did Moses let us divorce? And Jesus basically said, because you guys were so bad. God basically let you do it because you were so bad, but it was never something that God wanted. And I think, slavery is basically the same thing. To say something is God-ordained, to me means if something is God-ordained, then we could reasonably expect to see it like after the second coming, right? In the new heavens and in the new earth. We're not going to see slavery there. It's not God-ordained, but in the same way as he helps us navigate certain realities about the world, I think that's one of the reasons, one of the things you see about slavery in the Old Testament, right, is here's this institution that exists, and here are some ways to navigate it. Now, I have seen some things, and I had never seen these things before, so it's something I'm actually reading about right now, but apparently there's a stream of thought that I've found in Catholicism, and maybe elsewhere, that basically says that slavery itself is not intrinsically wrong. In other words, like, this is just the way that humans are, and that's why you don't see in the Bible Jesus saying slavery is evil and must stop immediately. I've just started reading that. That's really interesting to me. I can't really wrap my mind around it, but...
You want to buy your extra minute?
Nope, I don't.
All right.
So I'm reading about that right now. I'll talk about it later.
All right. Are Christians persecuted in America?
No.
Done?
Yeah, I'll keep going. No, look, do bad things happen to Christians in America? Yeah. Do bad things happen to Christians in America because they're Christians? Yeah, I'm sure. That's not persecution, right? Like, there is just not a systematic effort to repress Christians or Christianity in America. Now, look, you can talk about, like, oh, well, the LGBT movement is militant, and they want to do this and this and this, and you can make a case that certain streams of thought in America see Christianity as an obstacle, and they're going to do. But that's like, persecution is one thing, and I don't think there's persecution in America today, and I think that so there have been some interesting articles over the last couple of years since the 2016 election, and basically, so everyone in America, right, left, Christian, non-Christian, right, like LGBT, and all these different subsets, all these different people groups, everyone thinks they're losing. Right? Mm-hmm. Everyone thinks they're losing. Conservatives, Republicans think they're losing, even though they control the government and, like, have made enormous strides in, like, local legislatures and all this stuff. And progressives think they're losing, even though they have very obviously won the culture war and have pretty much every major corporation on their side. But everyone thinks they're losing. And so I think that so in other words, everyone thinks they are being persecuted. Right? It's not just a Christian thing. I think everyone feels like a victim. Everyone thinks they're being persecuted. And my deal is no one is being persecuted. I think if you want to make a case for visible persecution, I think the best thing you could point to might be the refugee crisis and the separating of families that is happening and happened a few months ago. But otherwise, no.
Good job. Right on time. So I guess they call it the land of the free for a reason. Now, speaking of the current administration, our fourth question would be, especially using Romans 13 as our context, the quick little commentary on government by the Apostle Paul, did God choose the current president of the United States, or did the people of the United States choose the president of the United States?
The people did. Part of that gets into, like, did I choose what I had for breakfast this morning, or did God? And it's like, well, if God knows everything, then did I really have a choice? Well, if God knew that Trump was going to be president, did the people really have a choice? It's like, no, the people chose God, and the people deserve it. There's a great quote, I think it's Mencken, I'm not sure, that democracy is democracy is the theory that the people deserve. I'm going to look it up.
Yeah.
People get. H.L. Mencken. Democracy is the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it, good and hard. And I think that's the deal. It's like we chose Trump. And honestly, I think that there's a comedian, Rory Scovel, who had a bit a couple years ago on Conan, and he sort of said, it's like, you're going to be in the voting booth, and you're going to hover over Hillary, but then you're going to think, but what would it be like if Trump won? And of course, like, everyone laughed. It was really funny back in October 2016. But honestly, I think that there is sort of a morbid reality show fascination, right? That was, I think, all through 2016, which is like, haha, that would be a horror show. But man, what would it be like? And I do think that played some part in the election, where I do think some people just maybe unconsciously wanted to see what would happen.
Yeah.
So here we are.
Yeah, it kind of falls to me. And I hate both of these examples, but it's just the reality. Like, being in Charleston, if someone said, "Okay, Joey, you get to decide whether or not this hurricane goes back into the sea, do you want it to?" I would say yes in a heartbeat, because I know the consequences of hurricanes, especially people that live close to the water. But am I a little excited when I check the news and they keep saying, yeah, it's getting closer and closer, it's going to make impact and all that? Probably so.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very common thing. Like, any time that there's sort of like this imminent... So actually, in Lynchburg, Virginia, where I used to go to school at Liberty, there were some alerts about flooding, where it's like, this dam is about to be breached, and if this dam fails, the water level could rise in some parts of the city 17 feet in 7 minutes. And part of me, and I think this is common, like, this is what we do with disasters. Part of me was like, oh my God, like, I've got friends who are still in Lynchburg, and that would be horrible and catastrophic. But then part of me is like checking Twitter, be like, did it happen?
Right.
Did it happen?
Right.
Because there's part of me is like, I don't want that to happen, but there's part of me it's like, I kind of want to see what that would look like.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's way worse than my example. All right. Let me ask you this then, just a little follow-up question from the last discussion. In Romans 13:1, it says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established." It doesn't even say allowed, but it's established. So when Jack Hoy III reads that, how do you read it? How do you interpret it?
God has established, human governance, right? Systems of government exist for reasons, and they're important. And part of the reason is again, this is Paul. And he's talking about Rome. Paul doesn't like Rome. Paul hates Rome. So this is not a blindly obey the state because they are good all the time.
Yeah.
No, this is the state, governments provide useful services. Like the government is important even when it's evil.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's this tension of what do you do with the government? And part of his deal is like, even when the government is evil, it can perform good and useful things.
Yeah.
Even when the government is evil, you should remember that that human governance is useful and important.
Yeah.
And that's like it's setting up a tension. He's not providing like an easy answer or like blindly follow the government. He's like pointing out this tension. It's like, listen, even Rome, right, that persecutes us, and even Rome that is really, has a lot of astonishingly gruesome and unhealthy things about it. Even this government provides things that it is sort of intended to do for the good of people.
Gotcha.
Right, and so it's kind of that tension there that exists in every government.
Nice. All right, last question. Is God the Father being referred to as a father as a result of the cultural lenses of the day, or is he better served and worshipped as a man? Male, shall I say.
Okay, say that again. So, I'm going to go and invoke the 3 minutes.
Yep. and I'll go ahead and word it differently, but maybe that was a little confusing. But why do we call him the Father? Is it because
Right.
when humans were interacting and
Oh, I
writing
see
down
what
the
you're
Old
saying.
Testament, that was
Yeah,
just,
yeah, yeah.
there's no way they would call God a woman? Or is,
So yeah. So in other words, is God portrayed as father and maybe male in Scripture because of the culture it was written in, or is it objectively
there
better
you go.
to refer to him
There
that
you
way?
go.
Okay, I see
See,
what you're saying.
you asked the questions that you're answering better than me.
I mean, you know, one way to think about that question is: are there times when it would be useful or good, or can it be good to refer to God as mother? And to me, that's almost the more interesting question, right? Because, of course, from in some ways, it's cultural, right? At the same time, you know, God regularly refers to himself in that way, and Jesus, who has the passage where he says, I have longed, basically says God has longed to gather his people under his wings like a mother hen, also teaches us to pray to God as Father. And so to me, that's almost the more interesting question. And I don't have an answer to it. I almost like to see us wrestle with it more is, are there times when we can bring the language of mothering and motherhood into our worship? And my inclination would be yes. Now you can do it in a ham-fisted way, right? Like we're going to call God Mother instead of Father. To me that's that's sort of the square peg in a round hole, right? Like, well, the way to fix it is to take away this thing and replace it with this thing. And to me, the better way is to see how can we introduce more language of mothering and sort of more female characteristics and traits into worship. One way, I think one way to do that is something that I think Protestants in particular have neglected, which is to focus more on not to the extent that some Catholics do, but focus more of our time on Mary. Again, not in a worship context, but in a meditation context, in sort of, I think there's been a Protestant knee-jerk reaction to minimizing Mary, right? Like the reaction to the, Catholic elevation of her beyond what I think is appropriate. There's sort of been a knee-jerk minimizing way more than I think is appropriate.
Yeah.
And, I think that my sense is that I think that the ways that God talks about himself in the Bible, I think that all of the male imagery and language is fine, and I think that we should pay attention to the fact that God talks about himself this way, and that Jesus talks about God this way. But at the same time, I do think that it would be really good to explore how we can introduce more of the mothering and more of the female characteristics
All right,
into
time's up.
reading and worship.
Great job. You need to just watch The Shack. It's already been done for you as far as exploring that territory.
That's right.
So how do you feel about all this, man? Are you satisfied with the answers that you gave? Because you're the type of guy that's going to go away from this and do a little bit of thinking. Are you going to be like Chris Farley hitting yourself and saying, "Dadgummit," and all that? Or are you going to smile and shake your head, yes, in the mirror, like I'm the man?
No, I never do that.
So it's like Ric Flair or Chris Farley.
No, Chris Farley, right? Like every time I look back on something I've done or written after I do it, and someone's like, "Wow, that's a steaming pile of garbage." I will probably spend the most time thinking about like the last question.
Yeah.
Right.
Man, was that kind of an indirect compliment to me? Like, was that? Like, man, good
I would
question.
never compliment you directly or otherwise, Joey.
Gosh, that hurts, man.
I really will. I mean, one, because I think the question is really interesting. Two, because I don't know, maybe if we had more focus and contemplation on the feminine side of God and the mothering aspects, and not just mothering aspects, but That's just one
Yeah.
aspect of the feminist side. But maybe if we had more of those things, and maybe if we, directed our focus more in that direction, I don't know. Maybe the Me Too movement wouldn't be cropping up everywhere in our churches as well.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe we'd be healthier and stop, treating women like garbage.
Wow, so you hate the Me Too movement. All right, well, that's Jack
No,
Hoey.
what? You were the worst. You were the worst. Oh my gosh.
All right, well, we've got Dan in the house now to answer the same sorts of questions. Do you have like a competitive nature, Dan? Like, is there a part of you that's like, man, I wish I heard what Jack said so I could destroy him? Like,
no.
Are you worried?
No.
Are you worried that he's going to come out like smarter than you? Look smarter sounding?
He might. I mean, he and I have been on together twice, right? At least twice.
Yeah.
And I respect Jack a lot. I think that he and I would have a great time grabbing beers, but we also differ quite a bit.
Yeah.
I was actually just going to say, it reminds me of Depolarized, not to plug my own show so early.
Do it, please.
But I asked, I had 5 Trump voters, 5 white evangelical non-Trump voters. I have these different groups of voters, and I asked them the same questions. I asked the white evangelicals and the black evangelicals the same questions, and then we talked about how their answers were different. So
yeah.
this is a very Dan Koch thing to do, Joey.
Nice.
To ask the same questions of multiple people.
I'm gonna start telling people I'm doing coke a little bit here and there.
Well, that's up to you. I don't recommend that.
Why not, man? I'll say KOCH, baby. KOCH. All right, so 2 minutes for each question. You have an option of adding a minute to any one of them, but once you do that, you don't get that opportunity anymore, and you can decide at the beginning or the end whether or not you want to do that. So the first question is, what are the chances in your head? So this is an opinionated question.
Sure.
What are the chances in your head that God is not omnipotent, and why?
I need you to define omnipotent.
Omnipotent would be the power to do anything, anytime he wants, with anything he wants. There's nothing he cannot do. So an open theist would not agree with him being all-powerful. They say that God's doing the best he can. So what are the chances that God is not all-powerful?
I would say, in my view, that the chances that God is not omnipotent are more than 50%, but I do need to qualify this. So, for instance, there are different types of open theism.
Yeah.
My understanding of Jürgen Moltmann's position is that God voluntarily limits God's self.
Okay.
So before creating the universe, God decides in some way, I'm not going to force these creatures to love me or know me or do anything, and I am not going to let myself know the outcomes of their choices.
Right.
So that is one way that you would say, in that case, God's not omnipotent, but in another way, he is, because he could have not decided that.
Okay.
In theory. And then another view is like Thomas Ord's view, which is that by God's nature, God cannot force anyone to do anything. He can't be violent, basically. I don't know which, I'll say this, I don't know which of those two views I find more plausible at this moment in my life, but I find both of those views more plausible than a traditional view, that God could literally do whatever God wanted. There are no constraints on God's actions.
So
I'll say that.
But you are, it doesn't sound like you're big on the idea of God creating everything and then just kind of losing control and being like, oh man, I thought I could have control over all this, but man, I really can't.
No, I don't think that makes any sense. Like, it doesn't make any sense that God would, and I don't think, by the way, that is an accurate sense of open theism. I don't think that open theism would say that God is out of control in any meaningful way, except that to say God has chosen not to be in control,
I've heard
is different.
Yeah, I've heard some to the contrary. I think there are some, and I'd have to do some research, but I've talked to some who have phrased it in a way of God's doing the best that he can do, and we should be advocates of God. We should also, believe in, hope in that everything's going to be okay. But random acts of violence I think some open theists would say God didn't know was about to happen, and maybe
No, I think but that still to me is different than the kind of colloquial sense of doing the best he can. I do think it's likely that God does not know the future.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're going to ask. Is that another question?
No, that's not.
Okay.
But that's good to get into.
So I do think it's likely that God does not know the future, and I don't think, by the way, that makes him any less than all-knowing. I just would say future states are by definition unknowable.
Yeah.
They haven't occurred yet.
Yeah.
And God knows everything that can be known, but the future, a future state, every future state or whatever is not included in that list of things that can be known.
Yeah.
However, in my mind, this is not such a problem because God also created the universe.
Right.
Whatever entity can set the gravitational constant such that the universe holds itself together and we can exist.
Yeah.
That entity could also like act to bring about justice.
Yeah.
Like, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, if I don't think that there could ever be a situation where God goes, "Oh, they've really gone too far. They're going to destroy this universe. I didn't see that coming."
Yeah.
I mean, at any point, God could, in theory, create another universe or end this one, or like whatever being can do that.
Yeah.
I'm just not so worried about that limitation.
All right, good job. The next question, was the type of slavery in the Old Testament God-ordained?
Was it God ordained?
Right.
No. I believe that the biblical authors in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, for that matter, when it comes to slavery, could not see past their own cultural moment.
Yeah.
And so they included things about God that in their day would have read to an average reader as like totally badass and, oh, that's a God really worth worshiping.
Right.
And I think that they were in error when they said those things. And here's an example of one is that in Leviticus, if you have an Israelite slave, you must let them go after 7 years. It's the kind of year of Jubilee law stuff. But if they are a non-Israelite slave, you may own them in perpetuity as an inheritance to your children. And that is essentially chattel slavery in the South in America.
Yeah.
And there's no legal difference between those two things. And I cannot believe that God would ever actually want people to do that.
Right.
The God of Jesus, I can't see that. So I think it's much more likely that those writers could not see past something that they assumed to be the case about the world. It's almost like imagining the world without media.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine that, and they couldn't even imagine a world without slavery. It was such a part of the economy. It was sort of like imagining a world without people going to work.
Yeah.
It is possible to imagine a world where no one has to go to work, but it's very, very hard to imagine that.
Yeah.
Right now.
All right.
It was like that for them.
Man, you're killing it with keeping it within 2 minutes, and
That was about 2:15, but it got close.
Did it really?
I'm looking. I'm watching the clock.
But I think I asked you some follow up within there. If I didn't, then
Okay, sure.
So
sure.
would you put slavery in the same category of how, like, when it comes to things and how God handles them? Did he handle slavery in the same way he handled polygamy? It's like, I don't like this, but this is their culture, and I'm not going to just blow them up or rain down fire. So I'm going to just work within this bullshit for a season.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously really weird when the more we anthropomorphize God's sort of mental states, the weirder it gets.
Right.
Right? Like the more colloquial with our language, the less it sounds like something God would do. But for lack of, better terminology, yeah, I would say God, like I like the statement that the Old Testament is a record of God's people, reckoning with a very real God.
Yeah.
As well as they could do.
Yeah.
And I think that God, I think that God basically puts up with us. I'll answer this by saying, can you imagine it being otherwise?
Right.
If it's not that way, it's very weird that human beings have had such changes in ethical norms and ethical opinions over the years, and that what God really wanted us to do was always have exactly the right ethics. Like,
right.
then he did a poor job.
Right.
It seems more like that's not the point, that God is always working with people, always bringing them closer to the center of his own being, which is self-sacrificial love. And so, yeah, he did what he could with those people at that time.
Yeah.
Just as he does with me and you and anybody. Just as he did with our grandparents who thought interracial marriage was weird. Right? I mean, they could, there's a million things you could think of.
Yeah, which to me is why one of the reasons why your stuff with Depolarize is so important, because it is just so frustrating when people can't, like, I don't even mind anger, I don't even mind denouncing someone, but within that train of thought, whatever the justification is for standing up against something, at least include in your head, hey, the person I'm talking to learned this stuff. Like, this is like, so it opens the door for you to have a little bit of mercy, a little bit of compassion. You can be angry, but at least, and I always use the example of my sweet grandma, who she has changed so much with how she views black people. But if a 20-year-old had the same mindset as my grandma, we would have no problem with Jan just saying, you are a racist asshole. But my grandma has changed a lot.
Right. And I think that God sees our starting place and our ending place, for lack of a better term. And that's totally true. And then if you can see that in your own grandmother, if you can see that in a 2-generation gap, I mean, just think you're going back to at least 1200 BC or something. I mean, yes, that's not a problem for me.
Yeah. All right. Are Christians persecuted in the United States of America?
Not really. I mean, there are sort of two ways you could think about this. Culturally, yes, they are. But politically, they absolutely are not. I think currently, right now, white evangelical religion, white Christian society has basically almost all the reins of power. Yeah. If you want to count the GOP as part of that, GOP has House, Senate, executive branch, and now a more conservative Supreme Court with Gorsuch, and then if Kavanaugh is even more so with Kavanaugh. So in official ways, and like Christianity is the stated religion of most Americans, there's certainly no real political discrimination at all of Christians. I think that there is I do think that there is a pervasive attitude in a lot of popular culture and in some of academia and like basically elite American culture that looks down very much on Christians and other religious people. And so I think that there is that kind of persecution. It's more of a cultural persecution. And actually, I would say there is some financial persecution here and there. The guy who got fired from, was it Mozilla, which owns Firefox, for having supported Prop 8 in California, like years prior. So he got fired. I think that's real. That's persecution. I am actually worried about religious liberty stuff. And on most of the judicial religious liberty questions, I fall on the conservative side. I thought that the Masterpiece Cake decision, which was 7-2, was perfectly reasonable, especially given the scope of that case. Yeah. And I do worry that I'll take my extra minute, Joey. Yep. I worry that those on the left culturally are taking too much liberty with their current moment of cultural power, although they don't have political power right now. And I would point to, if someone wants to read more about this, Andrew Sullivan, who writes for New York Magazine. He is a gay Republican columnist, and he's got an intersection of conservative politics for the most part, but obviously who's a big part of the gay rights movement. Right. And he feels like there has been a turn there. And so I judicially, I'm a bit more conservative than most of my friends who share my political views. Yeah.
Nice. All right. Does God, or I tell you what, let me read this passage, and I don't want to assume that you read the Bible in a particular sort of way. I kind of have a good feel for how you do, but me reading a passage does not mean you and I both agree that this is inerrant instructions from God. But I'm going to read a passage and then ask you a question. So in Romans 13, verse 1, it says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God." So with this as our context, does God choose the president of the United States, or do the people of the United States choose the president of the United States?
That's an interesting question. I think if you took that verse really literally, you would say that we should never have fought the Revolutionary War.
Right.
Right? We should not have America. That God established King George over us, and there was no reason to challenge that. I don't know that everybody takes that so literally. I don't think most Christians do. This is a really interesting question. So, does God choose? Well, I'm an open theist, so I don't think that God chooses the president. I think that we have real agency. I think I think first of all, probably the number one thing to keep in mind of what Paul's saying is that Paul expected an imminent end of time.
Right.
And so in his mind, there's really no point in any kind of political revolution.
Interesting.
Because this whole thing's going up soon anyway. And so, I actually think that that's partly probably why he tells slaves to obey their masters. Paul's not interested in upsetting the hierarchical relationships of first century Rome and Judea. He's interested in the eschaton, really, especially as I understand it earlier in his writings. I don't remember where Romans comes in that list of Paul's letters, but yeah, I would say so. Pepper it with that, pepper it with the apocalyptic expectation, and it makes more sense. I just think it doesn't really matter. Nobody actually thinks they should live out Romans 13 to the letter, all people, all time.
Yeah.
Or else you should, I don't know, move, or if you don't like it, leave it.
Yeah.
I don't know. Say that to patriotic Americans. That's weird.
There you go. All right. Is God being, we often hear God the Father. It is a biblical term as well. The Trinity is never mentioned in the Bible, but the doctrine of the Trinity definitely comes from biblical passages.
Yeah, it's inferred.
Right. It is very progressive for a Christian to refer to God in the feminine sense, and there are some that are starting to do that, and I think there's a great argument to say that if God is the perfect father, then he obviously is the perfect mother as well. My question to you is God being referred to as a father because of the cultural lenses of the days in which the Bible was written, or is he simply better served and worshiped as a man? Like, in other words, is it more helpful for us to see him as a father?
That's a good question. I would lean towards the first, which is that it has more to do with culture. I don't think that most people seriously think that God is gendered.
Right.
God does not have male chromosomes, right? So there's no what makes someone a male on Earth, animal, human, whatever, does not apply to God one way or the other.
Yeah.
So then I think of it now. You could say, so then really what this argument comes down to is, do you have a complementarian theology such that there are fundamental things about femininity and masculinity, maleness, femaleness, that are so tied up in those things that it really matters if you mix them up and get them wrong?
Yeah.
That person would want to say, yeah, there's something, even though God is, of course, not male, there's something about the way that men are venerated or thought about or treated, and we ought to treat God like we treat men.
Yeah.
I don't think that's true, but I have a more egalitarian theology. So for me, I think it's fine. I don't personally feel any need to call God she. I think that femininity and masculinity are both within God's essence.
Yeah.
But I just use father because, honestly, more for poetic reasons. I like to use the same language in English, by the way. And English did not exist when Jesus lived or Paul wrote. But in English, this is how the church has poetically spoken about God. This is how our Psalms have been translated. So I'm okay with just using it, but more out of continuity. I'm not making a gender statement.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. So we'll wrap it up here. This is not part of your question. Dan, you did a great job. I'm not gonna go ahead. I'm not gonna take the votes in yet on you and Jack, but that would actually be I'm probably gonna do it. I'm probably gonna put a survey out and who did better, Dan or Jack. But I am curious.
I think your listeners are more Jack folk than Dan folk.
Both.
I'm okay with that.
I don't know. I think we've pulled a good listening base from Bad Christian, but yeah, it'll be interesting. I actually think you guys, if you take let's just say anyone who calls themselves Christians, you guys definitely fall closer in line than the rest of everybody. In other words, y'all are, I would say both of you would be seen as pretty progressive, but yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. All right. So I am curious, thinking about God and that whole gender talk, it may be something that you don't take a lot of time in thinking about, but if you had to describe heaven and what we're going to be doing forever, and if that place exists, how in your head, and obviously there's some guesswork, but do you feel like we'll be able to walk around talking to Jesus and then we just know and maybe feel the presence of the Father, and maybe sometimes he talks from the sky and tells everybody, hey, just want everybody to know I love you. I'm glad you're enjoying your stay here. Or like, how do you think things will be visually? God, we cannot see. The Father, we cannot see, but Jesus is who we are able to walk with, talk with, hug, party with, shoot hoops with.
My feeling, my gut, I do spend quite a bit of time thinking about the afterlife, or God sort of making all things right.
Yeah.
After our experience here on this earth or in this universe. But I basically come up against this limit of like, I don't really think we have language for it.
Yeah.
I'll give you one little tidbit that I find interesting that I recently read. Dale Martin, New Testament scholar who retired from Yale a couple years ago.
Yeah.
He thinks that the most approximate way we could describe the way that the Gospels, or Paul, I think it's the Gospels, describe the resurrected body of Jesus is like a body made out of electricity. He thinks that's kind of like the closest thing to the language that they use that makes sense to our modern ears.
When they talked about post-resurrection Jesus in the Gospels? Wow.
Yeah. And that might have been Paul. I can't remember now. I would have to look it up if it's in Paul's vision of Jesus or if it's in the post-resurrection narratives. It might be Paul.
Yeah.
I think it's Paul. So it's like Paul sees Jesus as like made out of electricity or something kind of like that. I mean, it's kind of like me thinking about comic books or something. I mean, if I saw that, if that's the resurrected Jesus and that's what my body is going to look like, whatever that means, then I just don't have very much to go on.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
it's like,
absolutely.
Obviously this is mysterious.
Right.
But I recognize it. And, Jesus says, neither will people marry or be given in marriage in heaven. And, there's stuff about how it's going to be pretty different.
Do you think our sexuality is going to go away? Like
I mean, if we take that line from Jesus at face value, then I think it probably would be.
See, I mean, to me, that opens up a whole different can of worms. That if I can find two people that would be interesting enough to talk about it for an hour and a half, I would do it. And that is, think about how crazy of a thought it is for most Christians. They think that everything's going to be redeemed and we just get to enjoy things perfectly without sin, except sexuality. Now, what people tease me about is when I talk about this, they think that I have like this thing where I'm constantly worrying about whether or not there's going to be a sex in heaven. I just think it's an interesting concept.
No, it's interesting.
And why I think we can't think of sex outside of marital relationship because that's how we've been raised. That's our cultural thinking. And we've done all of our thinking on this earth. But what if there was the ability to experience sexuality outside the context of sin, outside of jealousy, outside of overindulgence, outside of lusting after something? It's just an interesting thought.
Maybe instead of making this a question about the actualities of the afterlife, why don't you just flip the verb tense on that and make that a question about your sex life on earth. I mean, why not just try and make your sex life with Priscilla as close to that, not without desire, but without all of, like, isn't that's kind of how the kingdom of heaven is used in the Gospels. It's on earth as it is in heaven, right? So, I mean, I don't know. I just think that, I mean, just from what we know about the physical universe, and then I think even taking some of these New Testament passages into account, certainly the post-resurrection Jesus can walk through walls, but he can also eat. He can, like, make sure no one recognizes him for hours at a time. Yeah. I mean, it's weird stuff. Yeah. It's not, he's not, the resurrected Jesus is not composed of the same molecules as the Jesus who just died. Yeah. There's obviously something else going on, or there's something added to those molecules. And so we know what will happen with this physical universe eventually. It will either expand until there's nothing there, or it will recontract on itself and blow up. I think that whatever God does with whatever is us, our consciousness, our soul, our self, whatever God does, I am confident that that will be just and that that will be beautiful, because that's the character of the God that I think I know and worship. And beyond that, I just feel I can't really figure out even how to think about those categories. And so I tend to take Jesus's statement about that, they won't marry nor will they be given in marriage, as like, you don't know what it's going to be like. It's kind of what he's saying. Like, it's going to be way different than you think. Right. And yeah, although, I mean, I could be wrong. I don't know.
Awesome, Dan. It's been very fun as always, and we are gonna catch up. I'll give some people some behind-the-scenes information. I got mixed up on some scheduling. What we are planning on doing for an episode soon, and what Dan and I were actually geared up for, and the scheduling thing was on me, not on Chris, but we're bringing Chris Date on, and we're basically going to talk about whether or not a Calvinistic God can act, I guess, perfectly with just and perfectly loving. What does that look like? I've kind of, I guess I find myself in a place where I have no problem with saying Calvinism cannot be the way. It just is a little messed up.
Can I leave a little teaser phrase for people?
Go for it.
I just was speaking with my friend Chris Hoke the other day, interviewing him for my own show, and he said something to the effect of, I never could understand how it was good news that I could escape eternal torture and then go hang out instead with the torturer forever.